So I want to look at a phrase that we see Jesus use in his Sermon on the Mount, and depending on the translation, whether it's translated this way, but it is a description of having a single eye. And I don't think the idea is to be a cyclops, or even to have a patch over an eye. That's not really the eye here, but I'm going to read it in 3 different versions, and on 2 of them we find something that we kind of scratch our head and go, what does that mean? The third version, I think, actually tries to present a little easier thing to understand, but maybe misses some of the idea behind it. This is in Matthew chapter 6, as I said, in the Sermon on the Mount, as it is usually referred to. And of course, he's describing things that have to do with how we view the things that we have in this life versus the things that have to do with the things of God. And in verse 22, he says, "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." That is the King James Version. The American Standard Version renders it, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light." I guess I could have. Did I read that one? No, I'm sorry. American Standard Version, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." The New King James Version, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light." And the New American Standard Version renders it, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light." Now, one of the things we might notice is that these words, as they're being described as single and good and clear, are obviously approaching these from a little bit different direction, a little bit different perception of what might be meaning there. The interesting thing about the word itself is that this Greek word that it comes from, haplous, it properly means folded together. That, as in single, it's something that is and can in fact mean, in a figurative sense, clear. Robertson says this. He said this word is used of a marriage contract when the husband is to pay the dowry pure and simple if she is set free. But in case he does not do so promptly, he is to add interest also. So it's simple and set forth in that way. Maybe also that idea folded together as this is being presented in that way. He goes on and says, if the eyes are diseased, if they're bad or evil, they may even be cross-eyed or cockeyed. We see double and confuse our vision. We keep one eye on hoarded treasures of earth and roll the other proudly up to heaven. We see seeing double is double-mindedness, as is shown in verse 24. If the eyes are diseased, I put that on there twice, but to emphasize that double-mindedness. Now let's read these verses that surround this, starting in verse 19 of Matthew chapter 6. So hopefully you've opened your Bible already, and you're looking at Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to begin there in verse 19. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 682. "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And then comes the verse that says, "The lamp of the body is the eye." So there's a connection here in what he's describing. When he says, "Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal." And then when he says in verse 21, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Have you ever thought about that verse, the way it's worded? He doesn't say, "Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also." He says, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And so we think about, what is it that we treasure? What is it that we consider to be real treasure? Maybe another way to think of that when we think about the eye is, what do we have our eye on? Oh, we might say that sometimes. You know, I've got my eye on this thing. something that we want, something that we want to possess, and most of the time, and many times, in the Bible, the idea of the eye is somebody looking to something with the intent of possessing it. So when we think about where is your treasure, it's really saying, what is it that you value most? What is it that you place the most value on? And what are the most important goals, or your most important goals in life? And in relation to that, what choices do you make that demonstrate your priorities? Obviously, these are things that are going to have to do with the time that we spend. It's going to have to do with how we spend our resources, our money, our energies. But it is about something that's deeper than that, and saying, what is it that we really value? If we look at verse 24, and we see this all connected together on the other side of the verse that we're looking at, where he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, mammon is another word that we kind of maybe are not that familiar with. It's not saying money per se, but what it's talking about is taking monetary things and making them as if they're a god. Strong's Greek dictionary makes a point of saying that this word, the Greek word, is mammonas, so it's obviously a transliteration. They just made a word out of it, and it comes from the Chaldeans, and it has to do with wealth, but it's personified, or particularly when we think the abundance of wealth and avarice, that it is deified. That is, we're making a god out of money, of material things, of possessions, that we're saying those are our God. That is the things that we're really focused on. That's what we're really about. And this happens, I think, probably when we think about things that may typify a particular society. We would have to admit that the American society is very focused on material things. And as such, it is something that can become a god. I mean, if you think about it, sometimes as people are planning their life, they're not talking about their service to God. They're not talking about their knowledge of God. They're not talking about how many people they can win for Christ. They're not talking about learning to be a better soul winner for Christ. They're not talking about developing a stronger bond with fellow Christians and things. What do they often talk about? They're talking about what they're going to have, what they're going to... Young people, I want to possess this thing. Maybe as they get to the point that they start anticipating driving, or maybe they're driving and then they have their eye on a car. I want this car. I want to drive this pickup. I want to drive this vehicle. And then when we get older, it's I want to have these things, and I want to go to these places, and I want to do these things that have to do with my life centering around the material things. And it's nothing new. But it is something to take note of. As Paul said in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, he says, which is idolatry. And that, I think, is one of those verses that kind of is intentionally shocking to say that covetousness is idolatry. Well, there's an interesting tie with those things, and that is that the word idol, in one of its basic meanings, means to that which is seen. Remember, we were studying we were talking about Moses in our class this morning, those of you that are in the adult class, and there was a contrast between Moses focusing on the seen. He was focused on the invisible God rather than the things which are seen, which would relate partly to the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian wealth and the Egyptian king, the things that are seen versus the unseen. We have a God that is unseen. We don't see him. We walk by faith and not by sight. But the things that are seen are the things that can sometimes command our attention. And covetousness, when we think about covetousness, if you were to define it, What is covetousness? When I had my brother-in-law, he called it more-itis. I think there's a sense of it that it's, on the one hand, we recognize there's a natural tendency about things that begins very young, that we want to have things, and there's a right way to attain things, that we go about it by means of, earning money and making and paying for things that way. And even then, sometimes there are things, once we've attained them, they don't have near the appeal that they did before we had them, and they become something that is just a perpetual. Well, you might even consider it to be kind of like the wheel that the mouse is running on in the cage, or the gerbil, or the, guinea pig, running on this, constantly trying to do these things and not really getting anywhere. Obviously, when we think about covetousness, it's something that relates to things that lead us to do things that are not moral. And people are focused on getting rich, why they buy lottery tickets and gamble in other ways. And let me just say a word for a moment about gambling. This isn't a lesson particularly on gambling, but I think it's one of those things that people have gotten to accept because it's so common. It used to be that Vegas, you had to go to Las Vegas to gamble, but you don't have to anymore. Not only can you go to Buc-ee's or one of these other casinos, you can go to the convenience store and buy a lottery ticket, and it doesn't seem as bad. But let me just throw this out there for you to think about, because sometimes, the gambling is not in the Bible, but covetousness is, and we're wanting to make an inordinate amount of gain just because we guess at some numbers. I don't even know exactly how it works. I know you're supposed to be some scratching things off. I see them do that on the commercials and things. I've never bought a lottery ticket, never plan on it. But what we're really, you think about where that money comes from. It comes from people losing. It's not the state that's losing money on those lottery tickets. It's the people buying tickets with the greediness, with the desire, with the covetousness that I'm going to be gaining more than I've really put into it. I'm going to hit the jackpot. I'm going to make all this. Well, every penny of that comes from people losing money. You realize it's the exact opposite of the golden rule. Now we put somebody in between, and it minimizes the significance of it. But here's somebody seeking to gain something from the people that are losing. There was an old, I think it was an old kind of a comedy western called Maverick, I think it was. The guy goes into a saloon, whatever you want to call it. And he tells everybody that he's going to sell everybody a ticket for $1. And put their name on and put it in a hat and draw it out, and the winner is going to win his horse for $1. And so, they all do this. The whole saloon brings that in there, and they pull it out, and this guy's real happy, and he says, "All right, come on back, I'll give you your horse." And he goes out the back. He says, "I'll buy my horse back from you for $25. He said, "Well, this is a $50 horse. Why would I sell it to you for $25? He said, "What'd you pay for it?" He said, $1. He said, "Okay." So he buys it back. So he walks in the saloon because everybody wants to get this horse for $1. They all chip in $1. He walks out with $100 or so because of people's greed. And confidence artists, con men, have done that kind of thing in various ways for centuries. But it is that principle of greediness and covetousness, of the wanting to possess, and whatever way I can do this, maybe with some limitation, but also I think and I want to mention this before we leave this, there are people that believe in a god or a goddess called Lady Luck, who is going to bless them, unlike the guy that's sitting next to him or that's buying the ticket ahead of them in line. Or maybe people think God is going to provide for them out of all this money lost by this avarice and greed. Contentment, of course, is what is in contrast to that. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6 says, "Now godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content." Really, the concept should be, you know what, when we have what we need, and we're able to, there's things that we can have in this life to provide for us in this life. This isn't where my joy is. This isn't where my goal is. And the next verse goes on and says, "Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many and foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from their faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." These are warnings that he's giving. We think of the time in which he was living, and where they measured wealth by the number of exchanges of clothes that they had. How would you rate? If you go to your closet and you say, how many changes of clothes do I have? And that becomes the measure of wealth. Comparing that to people of his day, comparing that to people around the world, we recognize that we live in a very, very prosperous world. Even when there are difficult times, even when things aren't going well, there's still a lot of prosperity and a lot of things that we have. And the real key in this verse is that he says the love of money. Money is something, material things are things to be used, not to be loved. People are things are what we should be loving. And God is who we should be loving. That's why when we find the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19, if you'll be turning over there, when we see this rather different requirement that Jesus made of this man in verse 16, Matthew chapter 19 and verse 16. "Now behold, one came and said to him, 'Good teacher, what good things shall I do that I may have eternal life?' But he said to him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments.' And he said to him, 'Which ones?' He said, 'You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, you shall love your neighbor as yourself.' The young man said to him, 'All these things I have kept from my youth. What do I still lack?' Jesus said to him, 'If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me.' But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions." Now, no doubt when we think about what Jesus is telling him, he knew that this man had great possessions, and he knew where his heart was. When he makes the phrase, "If you would be perfect," you really want to fix where you are and where you need to be. You sell everything you have and you give it to the poor. Why didn't Jesus ask that of everybody? Why didn't every person that come to him, why didn't he tell everybody, sell everything you have and give it to the poor? Not everybody had the problem that he had. The problem he had was where his heart was, which becomes evident in his unwillingness to do so. And this is in some ways one of the saddest stories in the people that came to Jesus. Here he is. He seems to be a decent fellow. He's a decent fellow. But in his case, the material things were things that he was unwilling to give up. And he's told, when he says, "Sell all, give to the poor, and come follow me," he goes away sorrowful. But let's go on from there, beginning in verse 24, with the words that follow after this. Start with verse 23. "Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Assuredly I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." Now I heard there's a place over in the nation of Israel where there's this little place that you literally have to get your camels down on their knees to go through this opening. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying here. I think he's talking about a literal needle's eye. He's describing something that is impossible, not just difficult. He's saying it's impossible without God, because his next statement, he says, the disciples heard it, they were astonished and said, "Who then can be saved?" But Jesus looked at them and said to them, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." You realize what he is really describing here is that somebody has to make a choice to put God ahead of whatever possessions they have, whether they be few or many. And there will be times that we may be asked to part with or prevented from having more because we're doing what God wants us to do. And that's again something that we need to realize is an important lesson for all of us as we think about the possessions that we may have. Let's look at the parable that is told in Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. This is where some people have come to Jesus and they ask him to, which was not uncommon in that day. They would have someone who was a teacher, who was a wise man, and they would go to them to help settle disputes that they had. So they said, then one from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And he said, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." I heard a really good lesson based on that verse by Brother Ed Harrell many years ago. And it was just called, "A Man's Life Does Not Consist of Things." He kind of shortened the verse and elaborated, that there are things that's not what makes our life. Boy, would that be a revelation to people today? To tell them that a man's life is not the abundance of the things that he possesses. I don't mean that people wouldn't realize it, but it's one of those things that people don't think about. They really focus on the exact opposite. This is what my life's about, is these things. But as we keep reading there, it says, "He spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater. I will store all my crops and my goods. I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Here's somebody that was apparently very good at abundance, at making good with what he had and keeping plenty of it. But what was he doing with it? What was he doing with it, and what was really the treasure of his life? This was the treasure of his life. And as is indicated by the words that are spoken to him by God, that you've not made preparation. You made great preparation for your continued life, for your retirement. But what have you done for your life with God? So let's go back to where we began in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 22. When he says, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is the darkness?" So let's just think about those words for a minute as he's describing, if the light that's in you, if the bright part of your life, if the shining part of your whole life is the material things, that's the bright spot, then how dark is the dark spot? Instead of thinking the bright part of our life really should be the things that are about God. And that's not something that's always evident from the outside. You know, it's not that because somebody has great wealth that they don't treasure the things of God. I knew a guy who was extremely generous with things he made, and he told me one time, he said, "John, you know, I'm just pretty good at making money." And he supported people, and he helped out people that were in need. He did a lot of good things with what he had. And sometimes we can look at the people, there were people in the Bible that were godly men that had wealth. Abraham was a wealthy man. But it's what we do, and what is the real focus of our life? What is the bright spot? What is it that this is what really, really matters? And would we, if Jesus or the circumstances, even if circumstances that weren't the direct message, I think we'd say, well, if Jesus told me to sell everything I have and give to the poor, I'd do it. It's kind of a safe answer, isn't it? Because we know we're not going to hear that directly from him. But what about giving up some things because of our focus on what we really need to do, or because of people that need help, or because of things that have to do with doing the right thing? And we make that choice, and that we include, not exclude. Not only do we include, but we make the focus of our life our service to God, our love for him, and our desire to help win souls. And I hope that we'll do that. We're going to close the lesson with just this thought. What is the focus of your life? I hope that your focus is in pleasing God. And it will affect the choices that you make. And it will affect the way that you treat people. And it will affect the way you look at things. But here's the other side to that. When your focus is on pleasing God, even if you have a lot of money, even if you have a lot of possessions, but your heart's not in them, then it's not a big loss to think of leaving this life and leaving them behind. If your focus is on those material things and you know you're going to leave this life, I think it could be quite troubling. In fact, the proverb writer talks about that, or actually it's in the book of Ecclesiastes that he talks about this, you know, the man, his possessions keeping him awake at night, worried about what may happen, or worried about what's going to happen when he gives it to the man that comes after him. What obviously would be someone that inherits, and we've all seen that. We've all seen that somebody inherits something, and maybe it's a business, and the father was very meticulously caring for this business, and then he gives it to his son, and his son just it just goes to pot. But you know, when your treasure's in heaven, it doesn't go away. It doesn't matter what happens to it when we're gone, because that's when it gets really good. So let's keep our focus where it needs to be. If you need to respond to the invitation to turn your life to God in becoming a Christian or returning to him, we invite you to make use of this opportunity if we can help. While we stand and while we sing.